Everybody, my name is Hans Schmitz, and it is currently 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our program for today. I want to welcome everyone. I'm one of your moderators for today, along with Rebecca Ketz and Ann Klein, who have their cameras on currently as well. If you are here for credits, PARP or CCHs, you should have pre-registered for those. And if you did not, you need to go ahead and chat with Christina, who has herself renamed as the PARP CCH attendance person. If you are here for CCA credits, those will be made available to you at the very end of the talk today. If you have technical issues later on, if you're having technical issues now, you're not hearing me, so it's not a big deal. But later on, if you have technical issues, please do reach out to one of the moderators here. I'll post my cell phone in the chat in case you are unable to access the Zoom later, if you want to take that down. So beginning today, we have Dr. Stephen Meyers, Assistant Professor of Weed Science at Purdue, who's going to get us started off with a little bit of a discussion on dicamba drift. Thank you, Dr. Meyers.
All right, good to be with you. I'm going to share my screen here, and I think there's a welcome question, if that hasn't been asked yet, and then a pre-presentation question as well. Right, so while you're answering those questions, I'll go ahead and get started in the interest of time. Yeah, we're going to talk to you a little bit about dicamba and dicamba and 2,4-D, or the auxinic herbicides in specialty crops. And here's an outline of what we're going to cover today. We'll touch on symptomology and some of the distribution through the state of Indiana of 3 specialty crops as examples: tomato, cucurbits, and grapes. We'll touch on some of the symptomology. So I already said that again. But the other thing we're going to talk about is crop residue tolerances, which is really important for off-target movement of herbicides in our specialty crops. All right, so the reason we're really talking about auxinic herbicides these days is because of the ongoing problem with herbicide resistance. So on the figure on the screen, this is the number of unique cases of herbicide-resistant weeds globally, and you can see that it's been growing essentially in a straight line since 1975. If we break that up into different classes of herbicides, what we can see is that if you look at the red line, for example, ALS herbicides have a lot of different weeds that are resistant to ALS herbicides. The triazines would be next, that dark blue line with the triangles there. So that would be things like atrazine and simazine. The ACCase inhibitors, which would be the grass herbicides. And then we start to see glyphosate resistance, the blue line with the blue circles show up. And in response to now more than 50 different weeds that are glyphosate resistant, we have crops with other tolerance traits, in this case, soybean and in the South cotton, that are resistant to or tolerant of, I guess, the auxinic herbicides. Right. See, I'll get the poll still up on my screen, so I'm going to close that, get that out of the way. The other thing that is problematic is that when we look at the amount of multiple resistance, so weeds that have resistance to more than one mode of action or site of action, we're seeing that increase as well. And so what's really problematic, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see the line that's got the triangles in it. There are now a number of weed species that are resistant to herbicides of 5 or more sites of action. So herbicides are becoming less effective for our weed management. All right, so as a result, what we've seen, especially in row crop agriculture, is more elaborate tank mixes of herbicides with multiple modes of action, and the use, again, of some residual herbicides or what we might call pre-emergence herbicides, shifts to glyphosate-resistant row crops instead of glyphosate-resistant row crops, which will be more problematic in the coming years, as there was just glyphosate-resistant pigweed confirmed in Arkansas recently. But what we're mostly here to talk about is the third point, which is the resurgent use of auxinic herbicides in these cropping systems where they can be applied over the top. All right, so we'll move on to some examples here. So tomato is a special crop to the state of Indiana. We're #2 in processing tomato production in the country. The USDA has us at 7,800 acres or so with $32 million in value. I think it's a little bit higher than that, but that gets us in the ballpark. Now, most of these are grown for one processor, red gold. And so if you look at the right side of the screen, you can see the Driftwatch map of fields from 2020, I believe, that, that said they grew tomato. And you can see it's really concentrated in north central Indiana. There we go. All right, so when we look at symptomology in tomato, according to Dintelman et al., dicamba and 2,4-D at relatively similar rates will cause similar symptomology in tomato. However, yield loss is going to be greater with dicamba than 2,4-D when they're applied at relatively comparable rates. The symptomology that we see is going to be similar. So epinacea, that would be the twisting of stem and petiole tissue, which you can see on the right side of the screen. Leaf cupping or leaflet cupping, which as it implies means that the margin of the leaf either cups upward or downward. And then leaf strapping, which would be an elongation of the leaf or the leaflet. The other thing that we see in tomato is flower drop, which results in reduced fruit number. So this is some work done by Steve Weller before I got back to Purdue. And he applied, you can see on the screen, 4 different rates of dicamba. So a 0x would be non-treated, a 1/10x, a 1/3x, and a 1x rate. So the top photo with any pair of photos is a photo of the plot, and the bottom photo would be an example of what the plants look like up close. And so this is taken a month after herbicide application. And what you can see is that, of course, the 1x looks like it's about to die, right? The 3rd-X looks rough. But what's interesting to me is that the 1/10x has recovered quite nicely, right? It looks like there are really no ill effects of dicamba at the 1/10x rate a month after it was exposed. But here's the thing. In an earlier study, also done at Purdue by Kruger et al., they looked at dicamba applications to processing tomato at 2 different timings. So the early bloom stage and the early vegetative stage. I'm going to draw a line here to show you where the 1/10x rate would be. What you'll see is that when they applied it at the early vegetative stage, they had about a 1/3 reduction in fruit yield. However, when they applied it at the early bloom stage, early flowering stage, there was about a 2/3 reduction in yield. So a more significant impact on yield when the simulated drift event happened at flowering compared to an early vegetative growth stage. The other thing that they reported, or why this happened, was because, again, the line is at the 1/10x rate there, and what you'll see is this is estimated percent flower loss. So when it was applied at the early vegetative stage, there was roughly a 55% loss of flowers. However, when it was applied at the early bloom stage, there was about a 75% loss of flowers. So if there are fewer tomato flowers, of course, there will be fewer tomato fruit and lower yield per acre or per hectare, however you want to measure it. The other thing that's important for tomato is that it appears that dicamba applications can reduce fruit maturity. So that's what this graph here shows. Essentially, the percentage of fruit that were ripened is what's being reported. And as the dicamba rate increases, the percentage of fruit that are ripened at harvest decreases. So this is important, of course, for any tomato grower, but especially a processing tomato grower that plants on a certain date. They apply ethifon at a certain date to induce a ripening response, and then you have to get it to the plant on a certain date as well. So the fact that we see an effect on fruit maturity is really important for this crop. Moving on to pumpkins and melons, in the state of Indiana, there are about 6,500 acres of watermelons, 5,200 of pumpkins, and 1,800 or so of cantaloupes. And you can see what the reported values of those crops are on the screen. The distribution is really statewide, but of course concentrations down around Vincennes as we might expect. When we look at symptomology in pumpkins, for both dicamba and 2,4-D, the symptomology is going to be similar. There'll be epinasty, which again is that twisting of stem and petiole tissues, stem callousing, so a callus on the stem, and sometimes stem cracking, and then adventitious root formation, so the formation of roots from stem tissue. In pumpkins, this is not uncommon at the nodes where where a leaf meets the stem. You have a node there, and if it touches the ground, often it'll root. But this is more dramatic than that, as you can see on the screen there on the bottom right. In general, pumpkin and cantaloupe are similar in their response to dicamba and 2,4-D, but for watermelon, it is going to be more sensitive to dicamba than 2,4-D. Some work that was done by Stanley Culpepper in Georgia, looking at the effect of dicamba and 2,4-D drift rates on watermelon, is on the screen. And so what we can see on the left figure, for example, they applied dicamba and 2,4-D at either a 1/75th X rate or 1/250th X rate. And they did that at 20 days after planting, 40 days after planting, and 60 days after planting. So what we're seeing on the screen on the left side is vine length. So what you notice is that it was more injurious. The applications in general are more injurious when they're applied earlier in the season versus later in the season. And what you'll also notice is that dicamba had more of an impact on vine length than did 2,4-D. On the right side of the screen, this is looking at the number of large fruit per plot. And again, we see an effect of application timing. So when the watermelon were exposed early on, the impact on yield was greater than applications made at 60 days after transplanting. And again, what you also see on the right side is that there was an effect of rate, where of course the 1/75th X rate was more injurious and resulted in more yield loss than the 1/250th X rate. All right, now we don't grow a lot of grapes as vegetable farmers, but there are grapes in the state of Indiana, about 600 acres based on the 2018 data. And the map on the left shows the wineries in the state from indianawines.org, and the map on the right is the Driftwatch map with the declared grape fields for the state. And what you'll notice is that there's a lot of overlap. So what that tells me is that a lot of these grape vineyards are being used for the use in estate wines at our state wineries. So within the state, there are about 116 wineries, $603 million in economic impact. It's a big tourist industry and provides about 4,000 full-time equivalent jobs in the state. What's interesting about grape is that the symptomology between dicamba and 2,4-D are a little bit different, and that's kind of a good thing to help us diagnose. For dicamba, we're looking at elongated growth, upward leaf cupping, and then fewer berries per cluster. And you can see some of that on the screen here, photos taken from our now retired small fruit specialist, Bruce Bordelon. And when we talk about 2,4-D, we look at shoot tip death, especially at higher drift rates, which then results in more lateral shoot growth because we've removed the growing point. Leaf strapping, fewer berries per cluster, are other things we might see. So the most prominent of these is going to be that leaf strapping that you can see on the right side of the screen. In general, we tend to think that vinifera grapes are more sensitive than French hybrids, and that French hybrids are more sensitive than American grapes. Now, even though as vegetable farmers we may not grow a lot of grapes, there are a lot of native grapes in the landscape. And so if you have a field that has a wooded field road or field edge or farm near a field, you can use wild grapes as an indicator of whether you have dicamba or 2,4-D drift based on the symptomology that's adjacent to your field. Just a side-by-side photo of what the two different kinds of symptoms look like. All right, so the important thing for specialty crops, yeah, it causes yield loss in some instances, but what's probably more important is the effect of pesticide residue. So EPA establishes pesticide residue tolerances, and you can see on the right side of this graph for 2,4-D we have tolerances in pretty much, I think, all of our specialty crops, all of our veg and fruit crops. For dicamba, we don't. The only veg or fruit crops that have a tolerance for dicamba residue are sweet corn and asparagus, because it's labeled in those crops. All right. So this is the law that dictates to us this zero tolerance policy. And so what it essentially says, I'll just read you what's on the screen here, but no amount of pesticide chemical may remain on the raw agricultural commodity when it is offered for shipment. Okay, so that means there's a lot going on there, but essentially what's important is the raw agricultural commodity aspect. So this would be before it's processed into whatever the raw agricultural commodity may be processed into. It's at the time of shipment. So if a exposure event happens early in the season and there's no residue at the end of the season, then it can still be marketed because it's at the time of shipment. And what else is important? I guess the zero tolerance here, the no allowable pesticide on the marketable commodity. So there's 4 different reasons that a commodity may fall into this category for a certain pesticide. I think the one that catches us in vegetable crops with dicamba is this subsection C. The pesticide chemical is toxic, but is normally used at times when or in such a manner that fruit, vegetables, or other raw agricultural commodities will not bear or contain it. There seems to be at EPA this understanding that because dicamba is not registered in our specialty crops, that they should not contain dicamba residue, which we know isn't always true. All right, so this is some work that was done, reported in 1982 by Sirens et al. This is looking at 2,4-D in tomato, and there is an allowable limit of 2,4-D in tomato. It's 0.05 parts per million. The problem with a lot of these old studies is that they looked at all the above ground plant parts. So the leaves, the stems, petioles, fruit, you just got all homogenized and explored. Well, the important thing here is that we're looking at the raw agricultural commodity. So we're going to show you what some of that data looks like in the next slides. But just to document that it's important, there's an important effect of rate and timing. So essentially, the higher the rate of drift, the higher the dose of the drift, the longer it's going to take the commodity, the specialty crop, to metabolize and remove it. All right, so this is some data from our 2020 research looking at the persistence of dicamba residue in processing tomato. So we applied dicamba at a 0x, a 110x, a 1/100th, and a 1/1000th, and then we came back at 0, which would be the same day we applied right after we applied. 5, 10, 20, 40, and 61 days after dicamba application, we harvested the green part of the plant. So the stems, the petioles, the leaves all went in one bag, and the fruit went into another bag, and we had them analyzed for dicamba residue separately. So on the screen here is dicamba residue in parts per billion at these different doses. So what you can see is that the 110x and the 1/100th were detectable at day 0. The 1/1000th wasn't. By day 5, we couldn't detect the 1/100th, any dicamba in those treatments, but we could still detect the 1/10th dicamba in the 110x treated tomatoes through the 20-day mark. What's more interesting, however, is what happens in the tomato fruit. So again, we're using the same rates here. What you'll notice is that for all of the rates of dicamba that we use, the drift rates, we see a bump in the residue from day 0 to day 5. And then all the way through day 61, we're able to detect dicamba residue on tomato fruit for the 1/10th and the 1/100th rates. All right, going back to that paper by Stanley Culpepper, in watermelon, they took fruit as well and had them analyzed for residue. And so for dicamba, they were able to detect 0.01 part per million when they applied it at 1/75th, 40 or 60 days after planting. And then in a second year of the study, they were able to detect dicamba both at the 1/75th and the 1/250th rates. for none of their applications were they able to detect dicamba or 2,4-D residue in the watermelon fruit when it was exposed 20 days after transplanting. So even though those applications were more injurious to the watermelon, they did not result in pesticide residue in the fruit. Of course, 2,4-D, in 1 of 2 years, they didn't detect it, and in the other, that was below the allowable limit. One important thing to note here is that just because we see leaves on plants cupping is not necessarily a 100% validation of an off-target auxinic herbicide event, right? So the other thing that's important to note is that often in row crops, dicamba and 2,4-D are applied with glyphosate, and when a specialty crop is exposed to the combination of 2,4-D or dicamba with glyphosate, it's usually more injurious than if it gets that auxinic herbicide by itself. If we're trying to diagnose whether or not we think we have dicamba drift, we should look at field-wide distribution of symptomology, look at edges of the field, that kind of thing. And if you'd like more information on that, well, I guess first of all, a plug for the folks at Driftwatch. I know we have a couple of them watching today. So if you're not familiar with this, talk to your county educator. They can educate you. And then just basically, if there's sensitive crops or beehives, this lets folks know to be aware of those sensitive crops when they apply pesticides. There's some new resources available through the North Central IPM Center on auxinic herbicide drift if you'd like to learn more about how to prevent it and what to do if you suspect that you've been exposed. And that same group is also engaging in a survey of producers to try to gauge how much drift is happening. So whether or not you've been drifted on, we encourage you to fill out this survey and let us know what your experience is with off-target movement of herbicides, and specifically auxinic herbicides has been. All right, so I think, Hans, maybe I got time for some questions, and then there should be a wrap-up question as well, poll question.
Yeah, we've got 3 minutes or so, and I know we've got at least one question in the chat. I'll hand it over to Rebecca to ask.
Yeah, so you, I think, touched on this a little bit, but how can we know if we are getting dicamba drift on our specialty crops? This person says their orchard is far away from any producing fields and surrounded by timberland, but just how to know.
Yeah, so I think, so a lot of the photos and stuff that I got this last year of suspected drift were not auxinic drift anyway. So I think the first thing that we usually look for is some kind of pattern in the field, right? And so that's going to depend on the size of the field a little bit, but you know, there should be some kind of gradient of injury from the source, you know, being more significant in the direction that the drift came from. That's usually a good tell. If there's sensitive species in a field edge, things like redbuds or oaks, those can be good indicators as well. Of course, the grapevine is also a good indicator plant. So using that, it's always good to talk to your county educator if they can get eyes on it, right? That's helpful. And then, you know, one of the important things with trying to detect it is that you saw it in the foliage, at least, it goes away pretty quickly within a matter of days. And so you may not see the symptoms of the drift event until the herbicide itself is not really detectable on the plant. So that's problematic to be able to prove that you had a drift event. The other thing is, depending on what state this person is in, is to get up with their state regulatory office and have it investigated.
Awesome, thank you. If there are any other last minute questions, feel free to type them in the chat.
And I'll be up again at the end or in a little bit. So if you have a question, dicamba question, you know, after the next talk, we can talk about it then too. So thank you.
Thank you. And yes, if at any time you have questions, do type them in the chat. If they're for a former speaker, we can certainly have them hang around and ask when we have those question breaks. So I think at this point, we'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to two of my favorite vegetable specialists, Wenjing Guan and Liz Maynard.
Thanks, Hans. Can everyone see my screen?
You're good.
Okay, good. Thanks. Thanks for the introduction, Hans. My name is Wenjing Guan. Together with me is Liz Maynard. Liz and I will, in this presentation, talk about understanding soil tests. We know there's quite a bit of information in soil test, and there's a few technical terms in the soil test that is not very easy to understand. And also there are so many factors could affect how we best use recommendations from the provided by soil test lab. That's why Liz and I here trying to explain some of those informations, and hopefully can help folks to best use the information provided in the soil test. We will start with, so what are the informations included in a routine soil test? So you would expect you get the information on soil pH, buffer pH, cation capacity, percent cation saturation. Some of the lab would provide information on organic matter, some may not. For the individual nutrient, you will get levels on phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and a portion of all of the micronutrients like sulfur, zinc, manganese, iron, copper, boron. In addition to the actual values, the lab also provides you an index like very high, low, very low to help you better understand those values. And also a good soil test lab should also provide the recommendations, the fertilizer and lime recommendations based on scientific data. But as I said, there's so many factors could affect those recommendations. We will talk a little bit about that later. So look at those information in a basic soil test. You may notice, there's no nitrogen. Why was that? Liz, can you explain that?
Yeah, I'll say welcome to everybody here. As Wenjing said, the standard soil tests, we usually use them in order to help us predict how much nutrients we need to add for the following crop. And in the case of nitrogen, measuring nitrogen in the fall or in early spring when we often take those soil tests, it just doesn't give us a good way to predict how much nitrogen we should apply for the crop. And that's why it's not typically included in a standard soil test. It's certainly possible to measure the forms taken up by plants, nitrate or ammonium, and there are specific soil tests or specific reasons you might want to do that. But on a standard soil test, it just isn't a good predictor of how much nitrogen the crop will need.
So Liz explains the nitrogen part. We mentioned earlier, there's some technical terms in soil test. And I think one of these things growers ask me is buffer pH. What buffer pH means, and it's normally show up like you in your report, you have a soil pH. Next to that is a buffer pH. Sometimes the lab may call it a NIME index. So the soil pH, we can understand that. And most of vegetable grower knows that we typically target the soil pH at 6.5, a little bit lower than 7. That is the best for most of the vegetable production. And if the pH is below that optimal level, we know we should apply NIMEs to bring that pH back close to 7. However, those soil pH, that value cannot exactly tell us how much NIMEs we should apply to correct this acidic soil pH problem. This is because how much limes we need, not just associated with original pH, it also associated with some other soil characters. For example, if your soil have a higher clay content, high organic matter content, and high cation-exchange capacity, it is more difficult to change soil pH, and this case will require higher rate of limestone. Okay, you may say we still didn't explain buffer pH yet. So what that means is there is a chemical reaction involved. So when the lab gets your soil samples, and they find that soil sample have below optimal soil pH, they will add a standard buffer solution in the soil sample. And as that buffer pH is supposed to bring your soil pH back to close to 7. And then after add that buffer pH, the lab will measure the pH of the mixture. That is called the buffer pH. So buffer pH is an indication to tell us how much limes should be applied to correct our pH problem. Okay, I hope this makes sense to you. In addition, buffer pH, we have another quite technical terms that is cation-exchange capacity. So Liz, can you explain that?
Yeah, so cation exchange capacity is just the number of cations a soil can hold. So what's a cation? That's a positively charged molecule. And in the soil, what we're thinking of for soil tests is often potassium. I've got these listed on the left, K plus, magnesium with 2 pluses because it has 2 positive charges on it, calcium, also 2 positive charges, could be hydrogen, sodium. We don't have a lot of sodium in Indiana soils, luckily. So where are these cations held? They're held on soil particles that have negative charges. And in the diagram here, that brown blob to the right with the little yellow minuses, those yellow minuses are supposed to be negative charges on the soil particle. Clay has a lot of negative charges, and organic matter also has a lot of negative charges. Those are called cation exchange sites. And the cations, the positively charged molecules, can stick loosely to those sites, and they can come off and go into soil solution, go back onto the exchange sites. That's why they're called exchange sites, because the cations can move back and forth between those sites and the soil solutions. So the cations are held kind of loosely. I think on the next slide, I've got a little bit more information. Yeah, so on your soil test report, you should see a column that's labeled usually CEC, cation exchange capacity, and the amount in your soil will vary depending on especially on the amount of clay in the soil and the amount of organic matter in the soil, because both of those types of particles have a lot of those negatively charged sites. If we see a CEC below 5, that's usually considered low. Above 10 would be high. And it's basically looking at, the measurement is basically a count of the number of positive electrical charges the soil can hold per unit weight. So the units you see there are MEQ, standing for milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil. And if you want to get really into the details, 1 milliequivalent is 6.02 times 10 to the 20th positive charges. Not that we'll probably ever need to know that, but that's where you'll find CEC on the soil test, and that's what they're talking about. I think the next slide goes on to, yeah, why do we care? Now the cation exchange capacity isn't going to change much from year to year. It'll stay pretty constant, but it can really make a difference in nutrient management for your soil and pH management. And here are some of the ways that it factors in. On this table, you'll see a column for low CEC and high CEC. And if you look at leaching potential, how quickly those nutrients will leach, it'll be a lot faster, a lot more potential in a low CEC. If you look at how often you need to apply things like nitrogen or potassium, those positively charged nutrients, at least some nitrogen, more often in a low CEC soil, because it may be leached. You may need to apply before planting and also as a side dressing or later in the season. The total amount of potassium that you require, if you have high CEC due to clay, if you remember from last week, I said clay has some sites, binding sites for potassium that are non-exchangeable. And so in that type of soil, you would actually need to apply more potassium when you have high CEC. The amount of lime you need in order to change the pH is more if you have a high CEC. The natural change in pH from year to year is less if you have high CEC. It's more if you have a low CEC. And then the retention of nutrients is less if you have low CEC. They're more likely, those positively charged nutrients are more likely to leach. There's one other aspect of CEC that we also see on the soil test. I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, percent base saturation. This is usually right next to where they report CEC, and sometimes it's percent base saturation or sometimes just percent cation saturation. But it's basically giving you an idea of all those cation exchange sites, what percent is occupied by potassium, magnesium, calcium, hydrogen, sodium, or other positive cations. Most university soil fertility recommendations don't aim for a real specific balance. So it's information that's provided, but not necessarily something that you'll be acting on based on the university recommendations. Another thing, I think on the next slide, that is also related to cation exchange capacity, but important in its own right, is organic matter. It's related to cation exchange capacity because organic matter has a lot of cation sites on it. So if you have high organic matter in your soil, that will increase the cation exchange capacity. Organic matter, if you just think of it as all the roots, crop residue, manure residue, compost, microorganisms, all of that contributes to the organic matter in your soil. And the stable part of that, the part that is not breaking down much anymore, is called humus. And that percent in your soil is not going to change really fast from year to year because it's fairly stable. But it's important to monitor it over time. Ideally, the organic matter level in your soil will stay the same or increase a little from year to year. Organic matter provides a lot of benefits to the soil. As I said, it helps increase the cation exchange capacity. Organic matter, as it breaks down, it can supply some nitrogen to crops, so it's important to know for that reason. It increases water holding capacity. The amount of organic matter can also influence the availability of herbicides and their effectiveness, so can the cation exchange capacity, and that can influence what rate you need to apply for some soil herbicides. So while organic matter isn't necessarily something that's going to change a lot from year to year, it's good to know what the situation is in your soil and to monitor it so you're hopefully increasing it as time goes on. The last couple of things I have there about organic matter are kind of general things about it. It's a carbon sink, so it's a place where carbon is stored in the soil, which is a good thing these days when we're trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. And then fresh organic matter is a really important source of food for microbes and other soil organisms that keep your soil healthy. And I think I'm thinking that Joe Rorick will probably have something to say about that in his soil health talk.
Yeah, I think now we hear more and more about organic matters. But I do hear, sometimes I hear people say like the high organic matter, the better. Liz, do you agree with that?
Well, I think soils will kind of, if you add more organic matter, that's generally better for that soil. But I don't think that just adding organic matter to get your percent up, high in a really fast way is the goal to have. It's just good to always be adding sources of organic matter and to gradually increase the amount of organic matter in your soil.
Yeah, I think I agree that organic matter is very good, but also like the balance of the nutrient, those things is also very important when we grow
Yeah,
both.
absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Another thing I want to briefly mention in our discussion here, it's about soluble salts. So we didn't mention soluble salts at the beginning, the information included in a soil test. That's because most of the lab did not include soluble salts in the basic package of soil test. However, it is a very important thing to test if the soil is from a high tunnel. As we know, in those protective culture systems, there's a trend the salt can build in the soil, and that can cause problem. So it's very important when we're doing soil test for the soils coming from high tunnels, we are able to detect that problem. There's a few similar names. I want to just very briefly explain. It's soluble salts we mentioned, and salinity, electric conductivity. Those three words actually are talking about the same thing. Like salinity, that is the amount of dissolved salts in the soil. And electric conductivity, EC, that is the measurement of the salts in the soil solution. So you maybe hear those words interchangeably, and we just understand they're basically talking about the same thing. And our vegetable grower, we know from our experience, like vegetables are like all different kinds of vegetables are not exactly the same in their susceptibility to salinity. Like if you look at this table, it's a very nice table, show you the yield potential and different levels of EC, electric conductivity. And you will see the asparagus is very tolerant to high salt soil. Like if the EC is 5, they'll get 100% yield. But if you look at tomato and the bottom, tomato is more susceptible to high salts. And if it's 2.5 EC, it's 100% yield. But as the EC increasing, the yield decrease. Okay, now I want to show you, this is from a soil test report. And if you remember what we saw on the last slides, tomato, when the EC is 2.5, is 100% yield. Why in this case, this soluble salt is 2, but it was indicated as very high. Why was that? So that is coming to another thing I want to very briefly discuss. That is, we should aware that for the same for the same soil characters, different labs may use different method or can be different extractant to measure that levels. So those would affect how we interpret those values. So right now I'm using the soluble salts as an example. And there are two very widely used methods to measure the EC. One is called 1:2 soil to water ratio. That is the 1 part of soil, 2 parts of water mixed together. And if the lab using this method, if we get a reading of 2, that is actually very high, and the plant's problem will be stunted. But there's another method called saturated paste extract, another method also widely used. If the lab is using this method, if you get a reading of 2, that is very little chance of injury on all plants. So I know it probably is too much for us to understand those different methods, but I want to make you aware that there are different methods. So when you see those values probably don't make sense to you, trying to find out what exact method is using so we can better interpret those values. Okay, lastly, I want to mention our discussion is we do get the recommendation from soil test lab, and I know most of us would follow those recommendations. And those recommendations definitely is a very good start point. However, we should also understand there are so many factors might affect the recommendation, like history of your crop. Do you have a legume crop right before that? That maybe contribute some nitrogens, or your yield goals. You are growing tomatoes in the tunnel and tomatoes outside, they have totally different fertilizer requirement. Also application method, placement, and the weather condition. So all those factors could affect your recommendations. And the lab have no way to know all those details in your farming. So you are the person best to know that. Because understand those factors might affect your fertilizer application can help us to critically thinking those recommendations. And last slide, I want to say some of those judgments you will based on your experience. And if you want some other opinions, like feel free to contact me, and this we will try to we can help you with your specific situations in fertility management. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We do not have time for verbal questions, but there is a question or two in the chat, Wenjing or Liz, if you would like to answer that individual soil test question from Melanie. So at this point in time, we will go ahead and switch over to Joe Rorick, extension agronomist and well-versed in all things soil health, discussing basic diagnostics for us today.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. And if that previous poll is still running, we can run my start poll as I switch over from my demonstrations to my slides. So we can run those in a little bit here. So hello, everyone, and thanks for having me back. Like Hans said, my name is Joe Rorick. What we're going to talk about today is our soils and how we're going to look for problems in our soils. We spend so much time learning and looking and trying to get everyone to find, if they are there, issues in their crops, right? So even today, we've seen pictures. This is what the leaf looks like when it's been damaged. And that's fantastic. And I'm going to encourage all of you to look a little bit past those leaves down at the soil, right? And there's a lot of advantages to doing that. First of all, you can find things before you have to wait and find them in your crop sometimes, right? Our soils are there all year long. Our crops ideally are not, right? If we're able to get in there and harvest them on time, then they're not there all year. And there's, you know, if you're going to be using a cover crop, for example, I know, especially in our specialty crops, the value of an individual plant sometimes is very high. It's certainly much higher than it is in our corn and soybean systems. So you may not want to go out and dig up a specialty crop plant to take a look at what the roots are doing or anything, like we encourage to do in corn and soybeans. So you can grow a cover crop over winter or whenever you don't have a crop in the field. You can go out and dig up those cover crop roots and have a look into your soils then, right? So at any rate, what you guys should be seeing, if we have the video spotlighted, and we should, yes, is 2 columns of water. And what we have are 2 soils. These are southwestern Indiana silt loams, okay? I think these are even, they might be patents, I don't remember specifically, right? On your left, these are the same soil, right? The only difference between these 2 soils is the management of them, right? So on your left, this soil is from a system with high disturbance, right? A lot of tillage, a lot of chemical disturbance, right? Now, some chemical disturbance is needed, right? We need to apply crop protection products. not all crop protection products that need applied or that are applied maybe need to be applied, right? So that's where we start getting into some good IPM strategies and things like that. But anyway, the over application of chemical and biological products can also be disturbances in our soil systems. So on your left, that's what we're looking at here. This is a soil with very low structure and a lot of disturbance. On your right is a soil from a system with very low disturbance. This is a no-till soil, and this has a lot of diversity with cover crops, right? So every winter when there's not a crop in the field, this soil is cropped to help provide residue, to help put roots into the soil, to break up compaction layers, to take up excess nutrients, and to keep feeding that soil microbiology. We learned about a soil test just a little bit ago, and what nutrients are in the field, and how important organic matter is, and how important what nutrients are out there are. And with soil health, we spend a lot of time talking about those nutrients cycling, right? Because if they're not cycling through our system, they can either be locked up and unavailable, or some of those nutrients can be lost from the field, either through erosion or leaching away, right? But at any rate, so we've got two soils here. We're going to drop them in this water, and we're going to take a look at what happens. So what's happening here is that water is rushing into these soils, and it's building up air pressure in them. On your left, as that water rushes in, the soil is not stable enough to withstand those pressures, so it falls apart, right? And because it's clouding up that water like that, you can tell that it's breaking all the way down into its individual sand, silt, and clay particles, right? The sands fall out of suspension pretty fast. The silts and the clays are what stay in suspension longer. They're much smaller particles, especially our clay particles. On the right, you can still see air bubbles coming out of it, right? So as that water works its way in, because we've not overly disturbed this soil, that water is able to go into the soil, and there's enough connected pores in there that the air is able to come out, right? In addition to that, this soil has what we call good water stable aggregates, right? So a soil aggregate is just soil particles bound to each other more tightly than they are to other particles around them, right? What we're the most concerned about in our soil health systems is that they are actually biologically glued together as well, right? There can be some chemical process to that, and soil texture and things factor in too. But through our management, we can affect how stable these aggregates can be, right? So we're vegetable crop growers here. We're customer facing, we're consumer facing. And in an era where more and more consumers are concerned about where their food comes from and what kind of conditions it's grown in, which soils would you rather farm when we get a hard rain? And we don't often see 18 inches of water sitting in our fields, right? Thankfully. But that's because that soil runs off, right? So we lose that soil. That water runs off, right? Over here on the left, when that water has our most valuable topsoil in it, right? Oh, and by the way, our silts and our clays in particular, are what those nutrients, those positively charged nutrients that Liz talked about, are bound to, right? They're what our soil applied herbicides are bound to. Our organic matter is concentrated in our topsoil, It's really light. You may or may not be able to see it. There's organic material floating here at the top. There's some foam built up. Some of that's sugars, right? How much of that is going to be here when that water runs off, right? When that water leaves the field, everything that's in that water leaves with it. We're probably all taxpayers here. How many of us would prefer not to pay extra taxes on ditch cleaning because we have to go in every handful of years and clean our topsoil back out of the ditches, right? Back to our consumers. Which field would you rather farm? And which water would you rather see in the ditches by your fields when your customers are driving by? Right? So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about soil health, and this is why we care. Right now you can see some particles falling in our soil health system. Because it's not clouding the water up, we can tell that those are still aggregates. Those are still bound together. Over here, not bound, right? And actually that soil's gone, right? Okay. I think in the interest of time and to keep our moderators as happy as possible, let's move on to an in-field assessment that you guys can do. Normally I would do a couple of slides and then move to this. No, hang on, don't jump the gun on the pole yet. No, that's okay. Okay, so I'm gonna move my camera. If you get motion sick, go ahead and close your eyes for a couple seconds. Or if you've been looking at a screen all day, go ahead and close your eyes for a couple seconds. And I will warn you whenever it's time to open them. Right? Ready? 1, 2, 3, close your eyes. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. Surprised, right? Okay, so now we're going to take a look at what we call our slump test. And we use this as an in-field diagnostic tool on how to take a look at our aggregates in our fields, okay? So same setup, same soils, southwestern Indiana silt loams. On your left is our high disturbance system. On your right is our low disturbance system. I've just got, these are sink strainers or bathtub strainers. There's two different sizes. There's a big one and there's a little one. And I always say I'm wrong, which one's which, and somebody always calls me on it, so whatever. There's a big one, there's a little one. Get whatever size you like. They're like a couple bucks. These are just drink glasses, plain water. This works with soils right out of the field. You just want to crumble it loosely into these sieves. You don't want to mash it, and you don't want to pack it into the sieves. So just crumble it loosely, about 3/4 of the way full. You take 2 glasses of water and you sit it in that water. Even though this is not our slake demonstration, right, that we saw in the tubes just now, even through that fine mesh screen, you can see on the left that soil breaking down and making its way through that screen. And you can see it collecting and coloring the bottom of the cup there, right? On the right-hand side, there's some little particles falling out, right? But you can see the water clouding up on the left. You can't see that happening on the right, right? So we're starting to get some indication here that maybe we have some difference in the stability of our aggregates. So then you just take a paper plate works well. I've done it on a shovel. I've done it on the bed of my pickup, right? That gets a little messier, but it hoses off just fine. And you want to take and lift those screens out of the water. You want to let the free water drain out of them just quickly. And you want to tip them over onto that plate. For those of you who do get motion sick, I moved my camera and forgot to warn you, so I'm sorry about that. But let's look at the difference here. Okay, so on the left, we can see that there is no structure left in that soil, right? Those aggregates have completely broken down in that water, and that's just mud now, right? We can try to move our finger through it. There's nothing there. On the right, we can still see those aggregates. We can see that granular structure. We can see that that soil held together. Right? I'm going to move again. Here's a practice run I did an hour ago. You can see that those aggregates on the left continued to break down, and even the little bit of water that was in them has been released. Right? Our aggregates are really important as for our water holding capacity, for storing organic matter in them, as places for our microbiology to live and thrive, right? All those are broken down, and what was in them, even the little ones we had, are releasing the water that's in them and continuing to go, right? I'm going to move again, and this is one I did yesterday. This is dried. How well do we think, if this soil gets wet again, how well, right? If it's going to rain on this soil, if we're going to run irrigation on this soil, how well is that going to go on the left if our soils are not open and well aggregated and ready to take that rain for that irrigation? On the right, that one's still loose, right? That's still friable. You can see that nice granular structure, right? So these are differences that we can make with management. This is what we're talking about when we're talking soil health, and this is what we want you guys to go out into your fields and look for. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the video on this and move over and start sharing my screen. Now it might be the poll time if we have it. If it already ran, that's okay.
If you're still seeing a full screen, go ahead and click gallery view. It should be in the top right, the little boxes that says view.
Looks good, Joe.
Great, thank you. Okay, now I have enough slides here that if those demos and those tests didn't work, I had enough here to cover my time, but I suspect I have already used quite a bit of my time. So Hans, are you my timekeeper?
You've got about 2-3 minutes.
Oh, that can't be right, is it? That is right. Okay, so in 3 minutes, we're going to cover my 30 slides. No, I'm just kidding. Tell you what, I'm going to go ahead. I want to show you guys my last slide, because when we talk about, Liz had told you guys I might talk about the importance of organic matter, and it absolutely is critical. And in addition to that, the nutrients that are available, we want them to be cycling, right? And our cycling happens biologically. And soil health is all about the biology, okay? So this is what we call our soil aggradation climb. And this is sort of the order in which we start to kind of notice things, right? So by keeping our soil covered, by lessening our disturbance where we can, by doing as much as we can, right, to improve our soil health by keeping our soil covered, providing continuous living roots, lessening the disturbance, we can start to see some of these things, right? So first of all, our biological activity starts changing, right? Then our organic matter starts turning over, right? Then we start to see some better nutrient cycling or some different nutrient cycling, right? Eventually, although pretty quickly, you start to see some improved soil structure. And then you start to see changes in water availability and things like that, right? The reverse of this also can happen though, right? So if you're not managing actively for water stable aggregates like we saw in those strainers and in those tubes, you can lose them, right? So you just have to be careful. Here's my contact information. Here's how to get a hold of me. If you guys would like to do some of these in-field assessments, let me know, and let's go out and dig some holes in your fields, right? Let's look for some of this stuff. So thank you guys for your time, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Joe. We do have time for questions for Joe, if anyone has any. I don't know of anyone sent to everyone at this point, but I'll hand it over to Rebecca to see if maybe there were some direct messages.
Nothing directed to me. Someone asked, are there other functions that you recommend?
So yes, I recommend all the functions, right? We need our soils to be functioning and working for us. We want our soils to infiltrate and store water. We want them to cycle nutrients. We want them to have good air exchange, all of those, right? I spent more time trying to show you what to look for rather than what our functions are, right? Because I didn't want to give you guys another PowerPoint slide. I wanted to leave the PowerPoint slides to people that are better at giving PowerPoint slides than I am. So yes.
It looks like they meant tests.
Tests, absolutely. Yes, of course. And that was what the rest of my talk was going to be if I didn't show you that one. Go out and look for bare soil, right? If you have bare soil, there might be a problem there. Better yet, go out and dig a hole in your field and look and see if you may have compaction, and look and see if you may have root restricting layers. That's what I mentioned with maybe looking at cover crop roots rather than your crop roots. If you're hesitant to go out and dig up your crop roots, plant a cover crop and go out and dig up those roots. And if they're not growing straight down, if they look like they're thickened, if they're growing in funny directions, if you can dig up your soil and you find a heavy clod with roots growing along the top of it that can't penetrate it, that's a problem, right? So you may need to do some tillage on that. You may need to intensify your cover cropping program to help to break up that, right? There's a lot of different things you can do. But yeah, as far as tests, first of all, go out and scout your fields. Scout your fields for pest issues, scout your soils for soil health issues, right?
Great, thank you, Joe. There's a lot of compliments in the chat on an awesome presentation.
Great.
Very interactive.
I think I'd see one quick here. I know I'm probably out of time, but I'm just going to keep talking and hopefully nobody interrupts me. Organic matter. Is more organic matter always better? No, not necessarily. Not just for the sake of having more organic matter, right? Organic matter is really important, and higher levels of organic matter are generally thought of as better, up to within reason, right? Once you start getting like 10, 12%, things start changing drastically and acting a lot different, and it's very challenging. There's no real reason specifically to have that. But low, if you've got a 0.5% organic matter, we'd love to see that much higher. And more important than that, you really want to see your nutrient cycling, right? That's why we talk about looking for function, because you want to see your crop residues breaking down biologically. You want to see good structure in your soil. You want to see healthy crops, right? Those are indications that your nutrients are cycling in and out of that organic matter and in and out of that soil. So organic matter in and of itself is important, and we use it as an indicator because we've got it on our soil tests. But as a standalone, no, it's not the most critical one, I wouldn't think. Yeah. But anyway, thank you, everybody.
That's perfect timing, Joe. Really appreciate your presentation.
Good. Yes.
Everything there. We're going to take 5 minutes now to recognize our sponsors. A little bit of a break to recognize sponsors.
Bayhorse Gold Pumpkin has quickly become a grower favorite. Farm markets love the dark orange fruit, its ideal ribbing, and sturdy handle. Commercial growers like the consistent fruit size and shape and yield, which helps them pack out their 40-count bins. Throw in powdery mildew tolerance that protects the crop and yield, and it's easy to see why growers have become Bayhorse fans. Visit rupseeds.com or call 800-700-1199 to learn more. There's nothing quite like fresh, sweet and buttery sweet corn. With over 100 varieties to select from, Rup Seeds can help you grow perfect ears for your customers. If you need a cold soil tolerant variety to hit the early market, one that will stand up to shipping, or one with great flavor that will keep your customers wanting more, our team can help you put together a plan to produce great sweet corn all season long. Visit rupseeds.com or call 800-700-1199 to learn.
For over 85 years, Norse Farms has produced and sold premium quality small fruit plants to national and international commercial fruit growers, home gardeners, and resellers. We're committed to providing customers with virus-indexed, highly productive plants. This commitment drives us to stay on the cutting edge of the latest developments in the industry. We identify and test new varieties and growing techniques so that we can stand behind our promise to deliver quality to you. From our on-site lab to our greenhouse, our fields to our packing house, our number one priority is to ensure that you get the best plants possible. For more information about Norse Farms, visit us at norsefarms.com. Whether you're an experienced grower or first-timer, we're here to help you every step of the way. We look forward to growing with you.
Hello, my name is Brandon Lean, and I am the Deputy of Community Development Programs for Pathstone, Indiana. Pathstone builds family and individual self-sufficiency by strengthening farm worker, rural, and urban communities. Pathstone promotes social justice through programs and advocacy. Pathstone offers a great on-farm housing rehab program to help Indiana growers improve and maintain their on-farm housing. Indiana growers can receive up to $2,000 of matched funds for rehab projects. Indiana farmers, growers, and community groups seeking to substantially renovate or construct housing for farm workers are also eligible for technical assistance free of charge. You can contact me, Brandon Lean, at 765-286-2162 or blien@pathstone.org. Thank you.
All right, it is 2:15, and that means we are rolling right along. Back again to Stephen Meyers. I see he's going to cover glyphosate weed control and controversy in 20 minutes, which should be quite the race. So thank you for returning, Dr. Meyers.
We'll see how this goes. Yeah, so I think we've got a pre-presentation poll question. There it is. All right, and we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation here. Yeah, 20 minutes to talk about something this controversial. It's one of those topics that, you know, a year ago when we had less important things to worry about. If you said glyphosate, you know, it's one of those words that just kind of gets some people riled up. So we're gonna try to talk about the herbicide itself and then why it has been in the news over the last couple of years. So we'll give a background, talk about how it works in the plant, and we'll try not to get too bogged down in the science there, and then we'll talk about the IRC designation of glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. Right. First, the background. So as a molecule, it was synthesized in 1950 for unknown purposes, and then in 1970, it was first tested by Monsanto as a herbicide. It was first marketed in 1974 as a post-emergence non-selective herbicide, so it would be applied to emerged weeds and would have activity on a number of different plants. Before Roundup Ready crops in 1996, selectivity had to be achieved by crop avoidance, so applying it either as a burn down or after planting but before crop emergence, or with a hooded or directed application, those kinds of things. Primarily, it was sold as isopropylamine salt of glyphosate anion. However, after it came off patent in 2000, there are other formulations available. So how does it work? Well, it's applied foliarly, so applied to the above ground plant parts, translocated by xylem and phloem in the plant. So those are the water and food moving conductive tissues of the plant. It inhibits an enzyme. So a lot of herbicides work by inhibiting enzymes, and the one that this acts on is called EPSP synthase, which is found in plants and some microorganisms. It's not found in humans because we get the products of this pathway through our diet. And for the longest time, this is why glyphosate was believed to have no mammalian toxicity. Looking at the effect on plants, it can stop growth in a matter of hours to a matter of days, depending on the conditions. We generally see chlorosis or yellowing, especially at the growing points, within a matter of days. This is really weather dependent a lot of times. So in warmer weather, this may be as soon as 3 or 5 days. In cooler weather, it may take 7 days before you see this chlorosis show up. After chlorosis, we begin to see necrosis or dying plant tissue. And again, this is dependent upon a number of different factors, the speed of this process. So the species of the plant, the rate, environmental conditions, and then the plant growth rate. Just to kind of document that it moves to the growing points, it co-translocates with sucrose to metabolic sinks. And what this looks like, essentially, what it means is that we tend to see symptomology in the growing points first. So this is sweet potato that's been inadvertently sprayed with glyphosate. And what you'll notice is that the newest part of the plant, the shoot tip there, is showing chlorosis or yellowing first. All right, so this is a schematic of the pathway that glyphosate works in. And so we mentioned that it works on this enzyme. Let me see, I don't have a laser pointer here. Let me see if I can find it. I can't, but that's fine. So if you look in the middle of the screen, you'll see this EPSP synthase. That's the enzyme where glyphosate works. And essentially what happens is this shikimate 3-phosphate gets in the enzyme, it changes the conformation of the enzyme, and it allows this molecule called PEP to bind. And when that happens, it moves this process forward. What glyphosate does is it inhibits PEP from binding to the enzyme, which means that all of these things downstream don't happen. And primarily, one of the things that we focus on are the production of the aromatic amino acids. So tryptophan, which we think about being in turkey, phenylalanine and tyrosine don't get produced. And then the products that are made from those amino acids also don't get produced in the plant. So it's found in plants, fungi, bacteria, and algae, this EPSP synthase enzyme. It's not found in humans, again, because we get the products of this pathway through our diet. So this, if we're looking at kind of a three-dimensional model of what this looks like, it's essentially these two globular portions. This is the enzyme. So the yellow molecule there would be the shikimate 3-phosphate, where that would bind. And then typically the PEP molecule would bind where that pink molecule is. Well, glyphosate essentially fits into that spot and prevents PEP from fitting. And so the pathway can't move forward. So what do we know? It acts, glyphosate acts as a competitive inhibitor with this PEP molecule binding to the enzyme at the same active site. It forms a more stable complex than PEP does with this enzyme, and it has more affinity than the PEP molecule does. So how does it kill the plant? There's a number of different ways. When we think about herbicides in general acting on enzymes, we think that one of the ways it can kill a plant is if you have a lot of things upstream. So in this case, that would be shikimate accumulating in the plant because it can't move forward, can't be processed. So that's probably not what's going on here. Aromatic amino acid depletion. So we're not producing amino acids. We can't produce proteins in the plant. That partly explains the toxicity. One of the things that probably plays a big role is that any one time in the plant, a lot of the carbon within the plant is tied up in this pathway. And so that is probably playing a role here. And then there's probably other effects as well. One of the important things to realize is that we now have more than 50 weed species worldwide with confirmed resistance to glyphosate. So what used to have an effect on some of these things may not anymore for our resistant biotypes. All right, as far as toxicology goes, from the human perspective, EPA classifies it as class 3, it says caution on the label, as mammalian acute oral toxicity of 4,000 milligrams per kilogram. It's generally regarded as safe. Some formulations are toxic to fish, mostly due to the adjuvants that they contain. EPA says it's not a reproductive toxin, no remarkable subacute or chronic toxicity. And then at some points in history, it's been explored as a pharmaceutical. All right, so fate in the soil. It is degraded by microbes. You heard Joe and Liz and others talk about the importance of microbes in the soil. So it is degraded by microbes in the soil. It's relatively non-persistent with a half-life of 47 days on average under field conditions. Biologically inactive in the soil because it's strongly bound to organic matter and things like clay in the soil. Non-volatile, which means it's not, put in the air and move that way. Photostable, so not generally degraded by UV radiation, for example. One of the reasons that we've used glyphosate so much in the past and even today is because on sensitive weeds, it does a great job. And so these are 6-foot tall pigweeds growing in sweet potato. As part of my master's work when I was at NC State, we applied a concentrated glyphosate solution through this wick bar. So just a little bit of concentrated herbicide filters through the perforations on this PVC pipe and onto the cotton canvas sleeve and gets brushed on the pigweed. And you can see about 7 or 10 days later, this is, of course, this is not from plants that big, but plants that big, if they're sensitive, would look just like this as well. It was an incredibly effective herbicide on large sensitive plants. Unfortunately, we don't see this used much anymore because there's so many resistant biotypes out there. All right, just to show you what this resistance issue looks like over time since 1995. So we told you 96 was when Roundup Ready crops were introduced, and you can see that since that time, we've seen a steady increase in the number of weed species with resistance worldwide to glyphosate. And if we want to put some names to those species, this is what it looks like. All right, so the reason that glyphosate has been in the news the last several years is because the IARC classified it as a probable carcinogen. And so that happened. The IARC is part of the World Health Organization, and that got some news. But what has gotten more attention in the media were three cases in the state of California where juries ruled in favor of individuals who claimed that glyphosate resulted in their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And if you look at the awards given in these cases, it's just kind of astounding. $289 million in one, $80 million in another, and $2 billion in a third. And those were all, bumped down, and they're being challenged. But just astounding figures there as far as damages due to these folks. A general idea of what the IARC, how their classification system works. There are 4 categories, and you can see on the screen we've got the first 3 listed here, Group 1, Group 2A, and Group 2B. Now, the definition of these categories on the screen, Group 1 is carcinogenic to humans, Group 2A would be things that are probable carcinogens, which is where glyphosate falls. Group 2B would be possibly carcinogenic. And so what happens is there are 3 different types of criteria that the IARC looks at: human cancer evidence, experimental animal cancer evidence, and mechanistic evidence. So is there evidence that the agent causes cancer in humans? And if there's sufficient evidence of that, then it's a Group 1. If there's limited evidence of that, but there's evidence of experimental animal cancer, for example, then it would fall into this category 2A, where glyphosate falls. So you can see the criteria to fall into these 3 categories. There is a Group 3 as well that are just not classified. There used to be a Group 4 that was called probably not carcinogenic to humans. That category was dissolved maybe a year or 2 ago, and at the time I think it had 1 agent in it. So the optics for the IARC are bad in that they have categories for things that are carcinogens, things that are probably carcinogens, possibly carcinogens, and we just don't know yet. So they have no category anymore of not carcinogenic. The important thing to know here is that the IARC makes these decisions based on a hazard assessment and not a risk assessment. And we're going to talk about that in the coming slides. So a hazard is the potential for a substance, in this case, to cause cancer. But risk is the probability of an agent causing cancer under real world conditions. And to illustrate this, I saw someone try to demonstrate this with sharks. And so I also decided to adapt a shark analogy for this because I thought it was kind of cool. So we're going to talk about the difference between a hazard and a risk. So a risk is a function of toxicity and exposure. So lots of things can be toxic, but not cause us risk because we don't have much exposure. So the example that I'm going to give here is a great white shark. We can all agree that a great white shark is hazardous. It's an apex predator, it's fast, got a mouthful of teeth. It's a hazard, right? Me sitting in my home office here in West Lafayette, you sitting at home, wherever you're located, our exposure to great white sharks at this very moment is 0. So even though a great white shark is hazardous, our risk from a great white shark is 0 because our exposure is 0. Now, if you're these folks in a cage, you have increased exposure. So therefore, you have increased risk. The hazard hasn't changed. Your exposure has changed, and therefore your risk has changed. If you're crazy enough to be this person out in the middle of the ocean swimming next to a great white shark, you have an incredible amount of risk because you have an incredible amount of exposure. Again, the hazard itself hasn't changed. To try to put this into perspective, here are some of the things that the IARC lists as Category 1 agents, things that are defined as carcinogens. So aflatoxins, alcoholic beverages. I don't know what to say other than when you read through this list, think about the things on here that you're exposed to on a daily or a weekly or an annual basis, right? Alcoholic beverages is probably one of those that falls into this category. If you're in farming, engine exhaust from diesel engines probably is something else that you're going to be exposed to at least annually, if not every day, right? Let's work our way through this list. If you're a painter, that falls on this list. Processed meat, so you know, we all probably eat some processed meat. Solar and UV radiation, which for those of us that work outside, we're keenly aware of the risk of UV radiation and cancer. Tobacco, X-rays and gamma rays, for example, are some of the things that are on this list. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of chemical names that don't mean anything to me and wouldn't mean anything to most folks in the room. So I mostly just put the most identifiable agents on these lists. So this is the category where glyphosate is classified as a probable carcinogen. Some of the other things, the other agents that fall into this category are very hot beverages. So if they're 149 degrees or more, and I think that's mostly a concern with esophageal cancer. Consumption of red meat, which again, I engage in on a weekly basis. Household biomass fuel emissions. So if you have a wood burning stove in your home, you'd fall into this category. If you are a fry cook at a fast food restaurant or a greasy spoon, let's say, emissions from high temperature frying would put you in this category as well. Shift work that involves circadian rhythm disruption. So in this case, if you work the night shift, you have, according to the IRC, an increased risk of cancer because we're supposed to be awake in the day and sleeping at night. Things that fall into the possible carcinogen list, you can see caffeic acid, chlorothalonil, so there's a pesticide, engine exhaust, this time from gasoline engines, gasoline itself, and things like pickled traditional Asian vegetables fall on this list. All right, so that is the IARC's view. EPA conduct risk-based assessments, so as opposed to assessing a hazard. Their review from April of 2019 reported that glyphosate is not likely to be carcinogenic to humans, and they thoroughly assessed the risk to humans from exposure and did not identify any risks of concern. The one area that I differ from other weed scientists is that I think the IARC view of or assessment of glyphosate as a hazard can be accurate at the same time that the EPA risk assessment of glyphosate can be accurate because they're measuring two different things. The most conclusive research on this topic is a study that was reported or that has followed more than 54,000 pesticide applicators in North Carolina and Iowa, and more than 82% of those use glyphosate. And what they have found is that there's no association between glyphosate-based herbicides and tumors or lymphoid malignancies. And they only really found one type of cancer that they thought warranted some additional investigation. And we'll point that out. So this is their data. This is a long-term study. The research controlled for other factors, including other pesticides, other health factors like obesity or being overweight, smoking, that kind of thing. It controlled for those factors, separated the participants into groups based on the level of glyphosate use. So you can see none on the screen there would be, they don't use it. Quarter 1, quarter 2, 3, and 4, where a quarter 1 would be people who use it infrequently, and if you see the Q4, that would be folks that use glyphosate often and in high amounts. So what they did was they looked at several different kinds of cancer. You can see some of it on the screen, and they found no differences between those that didn't use it and those who used a little bit or a lot. No differences. Some other kinds of cancer they investigated, kidney, you can see on the screen there. The one area where they thought warranted more investigation was this acute myeloid leukemia, where they did find some trend that there was more of this prevalent in higher users of glyphosate than non-users. There continued to be research done on this and reported. This one I'm going to point out because it has a co-author from Purdue. So this study investigated breast cancer cells in response to glyphosate and other things. And what they found, I'm going to read this to you, the multiple research studies that investigated the tumorigenic or the cancer-forming effects of glyphosate as the sole risk factor had not led to convincing evidence of its implication. So that's important. Environmental and lifestyle factors are pleiotropic, meaning that they happen together on different levels, including diet, tobacco, infections, obesity, alcohol, radiation stress, physical activity, exposure to heavy metals and other pollutants such as glyphosate. So what they're meaning here is that, and which I think is kind of accentuated by the last statement, glyphosate exposure is not oncogenic by itself, but it acts as an oncogenic hit factor that, combined with another hit, promotes development of mammary tumors in this study. So by itself, they couldn't get glyphosate to cause tumors in breast cells, but when they add other hit factors, they could. So in conclusion, there are areas that warrant more research in this area, in this topic, this field. One of the important things to point out is that agriculture, if you look at the list of carcinogens by the IARC, and a number of other things, in ag, we're exposed to a lot of those, right? So we need to be aware of that. The other thing we need to do is give herbicides the respect that they're due, wear proper PPE, observe re-entry intervals for all pesticides, and then consider integrated pest management, if for no other reason than the fact that glyphosate is losing some of its efficacy on a number of our weeds because of resistance issues. All right, with that, I will take questions.
All right, thank you much. We do have at least one question. So Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, someone asked, can you explain how Roundup Ready crops are able to metabolize glyphosate?
Oh, I should know that, right? Oh man, I can't think of the, honestly, I'm just drawing a blank right now, to be honest with you, but I can follow up. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Totally happens. Lots of info going on. Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. We have a few more minutes if there's more questions. I know someone asked, can slides be shared? I don't remember if we determined this. Just do any of our moderators remember? Or maybe it's on a presentation by presentation basis.
I don't know the answer to it, but I would like to get at those slides we just saw.
Okay, so we will follow up with that question. I know Petra shared a link to the recordings, so that's definitely being shared. Someone says best presentation ever in this whole series. So props to you.
That's pretty high praise because I just saw what Joe did. So
I will reshare the link to the recording.
Yeah, and I wish I could address the issue of Roundup Ready. It's something at that enzyme. I just can't remember if it's a conformational change where it just doesn't allow glyphosate to fit in, into that enzyme. It's right around there. But I just can't seem to put my hand on the words to say to communicate it very well.
To be fair, I took the class where we discussed this, and I don't remember a lick of it either.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah, so my farmer father had prostate cancer 20 years ago. Could that be due to Roundup? And I think, I imagine that's one that is part of that long-term study that looked at pesticide applicators from North Carolina and Iowa. I would think prostate cancer is one of those that they investigated. And from what I can recall, they didn't seem to find a relation there between heavy users and non-users. Yeah, I get this a lot of times. Weed scientist is the one that gets these kinds of questions, but a lot of times these are more appropriate maybe for a toxicologist or a oncologist. So there's a lot that I can't answer.
Well, it looks like we're answering the glyphosate question in the chat right now. A couple different posts, and we're a minute away from switch over. So thank you, Dr. Meyers, again for your presentation, and we'll go ahead and get started switching over to Dan Egel, a plant pathologist based out of the Southwest Purdue Ag Center at Vincennes, and his presentation on how do fungicides work. Oh, Dan needs to be made unmuted.
Sorry about that, Dan. I thought I made you co-host, and I don't know what happened. You should be able to unmute now.
Okay, Dan, slides look good, but we haven't heard from you yet. Dan, you appear to be unmuted now.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right, let me try this. All right, can you hear and see me?
Yes, you look good. You sound good.
Well, I don't know about how good I look, but so today I would like to talk about fungicides, kind of how fungicides work, and what I'll concentrate on is mode of actions of fungicides, and that kind of goes to the question, the poll question that was just there. My contact information here is here, and I think it's also on the last slide. But what I'd like to do first here is to tell a little story. This is their professor, Maynard, is walking through a vineyard in the south of France in 1882, and he's worried. He's very worried because downy mildew has been introduced onto grapes in southern France, and it looks like it's going to destroy the grape industry and destroy the wine industry. And this professor, that's his job, is to study fungi, and so he's worried. And as he walks through this path through the vineyard and he's looking at this disease, this downy mildew, he notices that there's something blue, this blue powder spread on the grape vines close to the path. And where this blue powder is, there's less downy mildew on the grapes. So when he gets to the caretaker's cottage, he asks about it, and he finds out that this blue powder is a mixture of copper sulfate and hydrated lime, and it was put there to stop people from stealing grapes as they walk through the path through the vineyard. Well, the professor gets all excited then and does some experiments with this mixture and finds a good mixture, and indeed this mixture works to help stop the downy mildew on grape. And in fact, if you go to a garden center today and you ask for the Bordeaux mixture or Bordeaux fungicide, they'll take you to a bottle which has a powder of copper sulfate and hydrated lime, which is very much like what Professor Meyers discovered in 1882. And this is arguably the first fungicide that was ever discovered. So from about that time on then, when humans went and looked for solutions to their plant disease products, their problems, what did they use? Well, they used the inorganic chemicals that they found laying around, copper, sulfur, mercury, tin, and different kinds of salts. So, and some of those fungicides are still with us. And this table here has inorganic elements, copper, sulfur, and tin. And copper can be found in Coside and Champ. Sulfur can be found in a product named Cumulus, and tin can be found in a product known as Supertin. So we still have some of these inorganic elements as active ingredients in fungicides today. So how do these inorganic chemicals work then? Well, they work by protecting the leaf surface. They're what I call contact products. They have to come in contact with the fungi on the surface of the leaf, and the cross section of the leaf you see here has blue drops on it. This represents the, let's say, copper on the surface. What has to happen is the spores have to come in contact with that copper to become inhibited. So it's toxic on the surface of the plant. You do not want the copper or the tin or whatever it is to go inside the plant, because it would be toxic to the plant inside the plant. And these inorganic chemicals have multiple ways, multiple sites of acting on the fungal cell. Could act on the cell wall, the nucleus, organelles, enzymes. So there's multiple sites of action for these inorganic chemicals. Now, in the mid-1900s, chemists began to do experiments with organic chemicals that had carbon backbones to develop chemicals that could be manufactured as fungicides in factories. So this, like for mancozeb, was the first one that came out in 1961, chlorothalonil in 1964, and these are still with us today. And for the most part, these organic chemicals were more effective fungicides than the inorganics we just talked about. And like the inorganics, they worked on the leaf surface, and once they came in contact with a fungus on the leaf surface. And like the inorganic, they inhibit the fungus in many different ways. And for the most part, these organic chemicals were less toxic to the plant than the inorganics like copper. Now I have to back up here. When I talk about organic products, organic fungicides, I'm talking like a chemist would talk about organic chemicals with a carbon backbone like ethanol, methane, benzene, whereas the inorganic were like elements like copper, sulfur, and tin. I'm not talking about organic agriculture. That's a separate topic and a separate talk. So when I'm talking about organic chemicals, I'm talking about ones that have carbon in them. So these organic contact fungicides then work on the leaf surface, but they do not have any inhibition on the existing infection. So you look at the leaf surface, you imagine the fungicide coming down on the leaf surface, it inhibits the spores, but you see here the existing infection, the hyphae, the fungus inside the leaves is unaffected. And these organic products, like we talked about, diethane and chlorothalonil, they have multiple sites of action, like the inorganic ones on the cell wall, the nucleus, organelles, enzymes, etc. Then in 1969, the chemists began developing the first systemic fungicide. This was released in 1969, thiabendazole. This chemical was absorbed into the plant and moved within the leaf, which is what makes it systemic. So that meant that these systemic fungicides then could stop infections that or inhibit them that had already started. They're safer for the plant. They have a single mode of action. In this case, they were involved in cell assembly. And this was the first of many systemics. And in fact, that thiobendazole is still with us. It's the common name for a product with a trade name of Myrtec. So these systemic fungicides, then once they were added to the leaf, they enter into the leaf, and that means they could possibly inhibit the existing infection that's already there, as well as spores on the surface of the leaf. But systemic fungicides have only one mode of action. In this case, we're going to imagine it's an enzyme, RNA polymerase 1. And this is important because if you have a product that's entering into the leaf, you want it to be very, very specific, because otherwise it'll be toxic to the leaf, to the plant. So systemic fungicides then have a single mode of action. And there's a committee called the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, or FRAC, has given each of these systemic fungicides an MOA number, mode of action number, which we'll see soon. And the label instructs how the fungicide should be alternated to be used properly to avoid resistance. But most contact fungicides, the one that to stay on the surface of the leaf, have a FRAC number of M and do not need to be alternated. So here's a table with just a scattering of different fungicides that can be found in the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. And you see the first three here, Coside, Bravo, and Diethane, have M's, which means you can apply these back to back and not have to worry about resistance forming in the pathogen population. Whereas the ones that have numbers, Fontellus, Endura, Monsoon, and Quintec, these have single modes of action. We have to be careful about these and try to avoid applying them back to back. And we can also find the mode of action number, the FRAC number, on most fungicide labels. Here we see headline is group 11. So now we're going to have a little cartoon here about how to manage systemic fungicides with a single mode of action to avoid fungicide resistance. So here we have a leaf. And the leaf, you imagine that the dots here are spores that are on the surface of the leaf. The brown spores are the ones that are susceptible to a fungicide we'll call X. And just by chance, there's a red one here, which is resistant to fungicide X. Just by chance, these mutations pop up, kind of like what we heard, how the virus has mutations and changes. So just by chance, there's one resistant one on this leaf. Now we're going to apply fungicide X, which we're going to call has mode of action 1. We're going to imagine we get perfect kill. And so the only spore that remains is resistant to fungicide X, okay? Now we're going to apply fungicide Y, which has mode of action 2. We're going to apply that, and that gets rid of that spore. So that's why we have to alternate between modes of action. Now imagine we have the same leaf. We apply mode of action 1, fungicide X, mode of action 1, and then we came back with the same mode of action. Now the spores, since they're resistant, they're going to increase on the leaf. And with repeated applications of fungicide X, the resistant spores will be increasing on that leaf and in the field, and eventually fungicide X won't work anymore. So let's talk about how to schedule these fungicides then. Here is a schedule for all summer long. The red arrows represent either mancozeb or chlorothalonil. These are contact fungicides. My point here is mancozeb and chlorothalonil have a FRAC code of M, which means we can spray those all season long back to back and not have to worry about fungicide resistance. But if we want to use a systemic fungicide like Pristine here, we're going to apply it twice here, but we're going to apply Bravo in between because it has a different mode of action. We want to avoid applying Pristine back to back, all right? But if you do want to use a systemic back to back, here's Pristine with group 7 and 11 and Topsin with group 1. We can apply those back to back because they have different FRAC numbers. Examples of fungicide resistance. This is gummy stem blight cucurbits, this lesion here on a watermelon leaf. Some outbreaks of gummy stem blight may be caused by strains that are resistant to fungicides in FRAC groups 7 and 11. We can't tell by looking, but we can do tests. And we have to assume that those populations are out there on watermelon and in Indiana. So that would involve these fungicide, Quadris, Cabrio, Fontellus, and Maravon, which have froc groups either 11 or 7 or both. Another one is powdery mildew of cucurbits. This is on a cantaloupe leaf, and you see the powdery appearance of the colonies on the leaf. And we know that Quadris, Cabrio, and Thompson, for example, in froc groups 11 and 1, some populations are resistant to powdery mildew, and so we need to avoid those products. So it's important to know which fungicides and disease combinations may have fungicide resistance problems. The ID56, the Midwest Industrial Production Guide, and the URL, the website is given here, has some of that information. You need to either alternate or tank mix products that have or may have problems. For the most part, you want to use high rates unless you know that a lower rate works in your situation, and I can help you with that. And then the label will have specific instructions and warnings about fungicide resistance. And this is the Midwest Industrial Production Guide, MW Veg Guide with 1g.org. That will take you to the website, either on your computer or on your phone, and it's searchable. You can search by crop and then pick your pest, and then it'll spit out control measures. So, and that'll include information also about fungicide or possible fungicide resistance. So this is my contact information here. I'll take questions in the chat box, or you can email me or call me, and I'll be around.
Thank you, Dan. You definitely have questions in the chat box, so I'll throw it over to Rebecca.
Yes, the first question is for some organic fungicides with good efficacy. So recommendations I think they're looking for.
Okay, that's a good question. So, so a lot of the fungicides that I recommend to people are some of those inorganics that we talked about, some of the copper formulations. Now, not all copper formulations have fungicide are certified or listed, for example, by the OMRI, Organic Material Review Institute, so you have to check that. Some sulfur formulations are. But there are also some biological products that are that have some efficacy. But when you get into some of the biologicals, that's it's almost like it works for this disease and it doesn't for that disease. So I would encourage the questioner to call or contact me, and I'll try to steer you to which ones work in your situation.
Awesome, thank you. The next question, is there ever a reason to combine an M with a single mode of action fungicide? Sure. I think that, and a lot of times that's a good idea. So for example, we're looking at gummy stem blight, and if you wanted, so you have watermelon, for example, and the group 11s are excellent against anthracnose on watermelon. But if you're worried about gummy stem blight, you want to include something in there that will work for the gummy stem blight, because the group 11 probably will not. So I would say if you use something like a Quadris with a group 11 and combined it with a Bravo, which is a group M, I think that would be an excellent combination. Great. The next question, is there a table to define different fungi on set? How can we know when application will be most effective? The initial application, for the most part, well, for example, in vine crops, I recommend at first flower or when the vines close within the row. That's a good question, because for the most part, I like to have people apply the first fungicide before you start seeing disease, or very, very early on in the process. Don't wait to get the disease to get started before you spray. And then the last question so far, is this kind of information available for fruit growers? Yes. So I think it's the ID 456. Jana Beckerman is my counterpart, and she has this information in fruit crops. So I mean, if you can contact Jana or look up the
Is that right? ID 456, I think, is the fruit guide. And that will have a lot of the same tables and stuff that we have for the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide.
Okay, Dan, you managed to answer the question about there being a table to determine fungal onset without bringing up Melcast.
Okay.
Did you mean to do that?
Well, so to me, Melcast doesn't. So to me, the first spray should go on before Melcast. So the first spray, the onset of the spray should be at a phenological stage. So for vine crops, when they touch within the row, or at first flowering of tomatoes, that kind of stuff. But then you're right to schedule fungicides. Then we have in Indiana, we have a weather-based disease forecasting system that can tell you when to spray, and as opposed to using a calendar-based system. I should have known to be careful about trading around a weather-based question with you, Ron.
Well, that brings us to the 3 or 4 o'clock hour, depending on your time zone. Dan, we sure appreciate your time today. Excellent presentation. We do have the closing items of business that need to occur. So stick around if you're needing those CCA credits. And as it says here on the screen, watch for an email with a post survey. Your participation is voluntary, confidential, and appreciated. If you need a paper survey, you have Lais's information there on the screen to get with her. At this point in time, I will stop talking and let any of my co-conspirators add in anything I may have forgotten.
I think it's good. I'm getting ready to share the CCA credits. If you need those, please stick around. Otherwise, thank you for attending.
And remember, that's only for CCA credits. The PARP credits, you should reach out to Christina or whoever. I think Christina would be the person to reach out to for PARP credits, if I'm correct.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Hans. Appreciate your time today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for your time. And we did, I don't know if Jeff's still on.
He was a second ago.
We did have a potential additional sponsor reach out wanting to know how they can get involved. So it's very great.
I think we have a post a follow-up discussion to talk about this too scheduled. So
okay.
All right. I think we can shut it down unless you see a reason to keep this open.
Oh, I will end session. Oh, yep, I can end it for everybody. Thanks to all of our speakers and everybody for being here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.